The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, a look at the consequences of closing youth detention centers. First up, J.N. Jagannathan and company discuss what's behind the rise in youth crime in Ontario. That's all ahead on the agenda.
Statistics show that youth violence is on the rise in Ontario. High-profile incidents, including the swarming death of a homeless man by a group of young girls and a 13-year-old boy charged with first-degree murder. What's causing young people to commit such horrific acts of violence? Joining us now to discuss this troubling trend, we welcome Scott Wortley, Professor of Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies at the University of Toronto and former Research Director on the Ontario Government's Roots of Youth Violence Inquiry. Lena Audrumary, Chair of the Ontario Youth Justice Task Force and co-founder of Stop Now and Plan, or SNAP, an early intervention mental health and anti-violence initiative. Devon Jones, founder of Youth Association for Academics, Athletics, and Character Education, or YACE, and Michael Korestein, former senior Crown attorney, now founding partner and criminal lawyer at Michael Korestein Law. Welcome everyone to studio. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to start off by showing some data. This is the Youth Crime Severity Index in Ontario from 2003 to 2023 based on the Uniform Crime Reporting Survey. The Crime Severity Index is a tool that takes into account the amount of crime that's happening and the severity of it. Here, in terms of youth crime in Ontario, we can see a steady decrease in the early 2000s and 2010s, but there, just at 2021, you can see a spike. Now, looking specifically at youth violent crime, there was less of a reduction over the past 20 years and some clear recent spikes. Lena, I'm going to come to you. Looking at that data, how do you react to those trends?
So from 2004, we saw a huge decline, like 65, 67% decline. But then what we saw is in 2021, we start to see an upward spike a bit. 6%, I think what we're finding is that it's more accused of a violent crime.
Okay.
But it is going up, and we need to be cautious of that, and we need to be watching it.
Do we know why?
There's lots of reasons why. I think the pandemic had a major impact. You know, we had kids being isolated. They were, you know, kids we're social beings. And so here they are isolated, they're not going to school in person, and their social world is at home. That's all they're doing. And so I think what we've seen is parents reported that up to almost 80% of parents reporting that their kids' behavior was getting worse, especially those kids who already were experiencing issues. And about almost 60% of those parents whose kids were not, they were seeing some major issues with their behavior.
Okay. Scott, I want to talk to you. This is obviously something that you have looked at for quite a while. You worked on the Roots of Youth Violence Inquiry in 2008. Has anything changed since? Is this data concerning? Is this something that, you know, it is different from what you were looking at earlier?
Yeah, I think the data differs significantly from public perception. When you talk to people and when you poll the Canadian population, there tends to be this feeling that crime is out of control, that it is always increasing, when in fact, as we've seen, the long-term trends are downward with spikes of violence here or there. And any violence is of concern. Any violence needs to be dealt with and is tragic. But I think that we've first of all got to address the fact that, you know, in the long term, things are actually going down.
Okay.
With these moral panics that are often driven by very high-profile, sensationalistic cases that create public concern. That being said, there are some disturbing trends that I think we have to monitor if we're not going to become more like the United States. We have increasing economic inequality that is often divided by racial lines. We have a shrinking middle class and a higher proportion of young people living in poverty, as well as an increasing wealthy class who is not necessarily interested with the problems that are taking place in the lower echelons of society. What we're finding is that this is creating a sense of alienation and disillusionment among young people, that they don't feel a great deal of hope about the future and are kind of removing themselves from the mainstream and taking place in subcultures that can be conducive to illegal activity, including violence. And I think that trend we have to watch. Particularly profound is the disillusionment that we experience when we interview young people about their future.
Right.
Many of them feel that they're not going to be engaged in the mainstream economy. And interesting about youth, what we're finding is that overall the young offenders, under 18, still, a steady decline. Where we're seeing a concentration is among young people 22 to 32 who have not been able to engage in the mainstream economy. It's almost like they leave the protection of high school.
Right.
They leave the protection of being youthful and become an adult, and they have nowhere to go. And they become increasingly frustrated and more willing to engage in the illegal economy.
All right. Devon, I'll get you in on this. What, in terms of that recent spike that we have seen in that last chart there, what's causing that recent spike in youth violence?
Yeah, I would say it's an issue that's been ongoing for some time. And one thing about violence is the fact that it's over time. It's an evolving phenomenon. So a lot of the issues that you see playing out in today's situation were in the process from some time. So with that said, you now have social media that leads to a proliferation of this where, in the past, I would know who you are. Now I can see you in real time. We can engage in each other in real time. And it's just a random, for me, teaching in Jane and Finch, or I've taught in Jane and Finch for over 2 decades, it's the random, indiscriminate nature of retaliatory violence that concerns me. It's someone puts a post up and someone is going to act on it because they feel somewhat disrespected. So it's now my duty or my right to go to that community and act on that post. So those are some of the issues that concerns me, just the random, indiscriminate nature of the violence. And systemically, there's a level of apathy and the lack of reaction in real time by levels of government, school boards, et cetera, et cetera. So if we have this issue that is escalating, how do we address it at the federal level, the provincial level, the municipal level, and at the school board, right? So if we have young people engaged in this culture of retaliatory violence, like how do we act? And what are those strategies that we put in place? And I think the lack of, or the inability of stakeholders to act and government to act is what's leading to this proliferation.
All right, Michael, coming to you. You've been on both sides as prosecutor and defense, so you can see this on both ends. But talk to me a little bit about the nature of this, the nature of youth violence. How is it changing? Are we seeing a change in that?
Well, the spectrum of what you would consider violent, I guess, can be anything from the proliferation of schoolyard beatings or bathroom-type group assaults that are a direct function of social media, I think. A lot, phones in schools, audience, clout, things of that nature have become more prevalent. The social media factor, which I agree, is gangs, for example, are operating at a very high level on social media through rap videos, posts that may or may not antagonize other rivals, and the reach for that message is getting out a lot easier, and there is that young person mentality of respect and my reputation and the neighborhood or my group's reputation, at least in the more serious violent crimes that we've seen an uptick in. The youth becoming part of that that type of, I guess, reaction is something that has exploded recently. And I think that that there isn't much we can do but look to social media for that. But I would also say economically, the the pandemic had a direct impact on the types of crimes that started to creep up. And I mean, we all know the auto thefts, carjackings, street-type armed robberies are a direct result of the juice being worth the squeeze for groups to commit these brazen acts in broad daylight or follow people to their homes or home invasions to get the car keys and things of that nature. And they're not going to enlist adults to do that. They're going to enlist young persons, as gangs have always typically done. And I say gangs, but any criminal organization or any type of group that's engaged in that type of activity. So,
explain that for me a little bit. Why would criminal, gang members, whatever it be, go to someone who's younger?
Well, I think, and that in and of itself is, of course, not a new phenomenon. I mean, that's always been the case. But I think there are two main reasons in my experience. One, at least in Canada, the youth justice system, it's well known that because of the laudable goals and the structure is obviously more lenient on youth. So there's a perception of less risk to convincing, let's say, someone under 18 to get involved in something, maybe more upside. You'll make a lot of money doing this. And even if you get caught, the penalties aren't as bad, and your record will be sealed and things of that nature. There is that type of element and I'm not suggesting that proactive thinking is a hallmark of the criminal system. Obviously, there's not always that much thought that goes into it, but it is certainly a factor as far as why 14-year-olds are the gunman in a carjacking, and maybe the adult is the driver or the lookout. I would say also the other aspect is control. Someone who's an adult in the neighborhood and the young kids are working for them, so to speak, they're going to keep their mouths shut, they're going to do what they're told, and they're going to be loyal because they're more susceptible to the intimidation. And I don't think I'm saying anything revolutionary in that regard, but it still holds true from my perspective.
Scott, I want to get your take on what Mike said right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's truth in the idea that some organizations, particularly those involved in high-end economic crimes like car theft, will recruit young offenders because it's seen, they can sell it that, even if you do get caught, you will have an easier penalty than if I get caught. I also think we can't take attention away from also the disillusionment and the alienation and the feeling that you don't have a fair shake in society. I think they both feed this kind of system and this kind of thinking. I also think there's a lot of violence, and Devon would probably echo this, that is more related to reputation than to organized criminal activity. So a lot of the beefs that we've seen, a lot of the gun carrying, we've just interviewed 400 individuals from some of our most disadvantaged communities, and some of them carry guns, but they're not involved in gangs. They feel that they need a sense of protection. They don't trust the justice system. They don't trust the police to be concerned about their protection, or feel that they can't be there every day. So they're grabbing almost an American style, I want to arm myself in case I need it. And that these, once arms are prevalent, these beefs break out. So I do think that some of the violence is related. Carjackings clearly have a utilitarian purpose. But there's other violence that is more emotional, more based on reputation. And the facilitation of these types of incidents through an increase in gun availability, I think, is also...
Well, I want to pick up on that, and I'm hoping, Devon, you can add to this. Toronto Police reported that this year there have been more than 100 youth firearm arrests. That's up 75% from last year. Walk me through what explains the rise in youth gun violence. I know there's a particular case that feels like it's growing right now in the Trethewey, Black Creek area that we've seen, where there was a case of a young boy who was scared to go to school, who was seen in a rap video, and it seems every other week now there's a shooting in and around that area. Hard to believe this is all connected in some sort. All doing, comes back to a video that may have been on social media.
Yeah, so let me give this some context. So, to Scott's point, so the issue of polarization, it's an ongoing phenomenon. So, for example, I teach in I've worked in Jane and Finch, and I'll touch on the Black Creek, Western Road dichotomy in a second. So, you have the kids north of Finch, the kids south of Finch. And, for some time, they've been engaged in this culture of back and forth. So to Scott's point, I don't want to be involved in this stuff, but if I'm walking home from school and I'm getting shot at, or folks know that I'm from this area, from this postal code, then it makes me an enemy. So you have young people who want nothing to do with this issue, who are pretty much forced in it just based on their postal code. So it's so frightening where you have kids are now asking for police presence, right? You have kids are now saying, we want police presence. Kids won't play outside or engage unless the neighborhood police officers are prevalent. Or present. Like, this is Canada. Just imagine a community just based on the volatility, based on the indiscriminate nature of gunplay where kids can't play outside. And then we have to ask ourselves, what are the mental health implications of these issues as it relates to the constant exposure to violence, the issues around PTSD, the issues around a concurrent psychological disorder, and these young people or these students from the lowest achieving schools, the lowest achieving students, they're from communities who are predominantly poor, under-resourced, underserviced. Only 3% of kids from Jane and Finch, income level 36,000 lower, family income 36,000 lower, who has a chance to play organized sports. Organized sports is such an ecosystem, to engage and provide opportunities, but they've been pretty much priced out of the market. So these young people can't do much, don't have much to do. They can't engage in anything constructive, and then you're dealing with this culture of back and forth violence where it's random, it's indiscriminate, and for someone like myself that work in that community, I can get in my car, get in the 4-1, and it's gone. Right. For those young people, they're navigating this violence each and every single day. Just imagine your children, our children, living in that reality and dealing with that every day, and just imagine how depraved the impact must be.
All right, Lena, I want to get you in here. You work with young kids from an early age. What are the signs you're looking for a young person who may, unfortunately, be on a path towards violence? Yeah. That's an indicator for you.
So what Devon said was right on, spot on. What happens to you matters. And the neuroscience shows that your brain actually gets impacted. So kids who engage in disruptive antisocial behavior, the neuroscience are finding that their frontal lobe is impacted. And so we need to think about how do we help these kids alter it, because it's fight, flight, and freeze. If they're living in these extremely traumatic scenarios or situations in their lives, which they are, their brain is being disrupted. And so we need to think about how do we do this. So one of the things that we have been doing is we developed a program called SNAP, which stands for Stop Now and Plan. It teaches kids how to stop and think before they act and make better choices in the moment. And what if I told you the research, University of Toronto, Sick Kids, Steve Woltering just did something. They found that Dr. Nathan Kola did. They found that we can change structural changes in the brain in just 13 weeks. So it's like pruning a tree, right? So the more you get these kids to practice the strategy of SNAP, for example, you're building new synapses. And so instead of being constantly in that fight, flight, and freeze, I call that your lizard brain. You're moving that processing to your wizard brain. And the kids are able to stop and think before they act and make better choices in the moment. So, and if you, and I, this is Alex Beccaro will tell you, if he had to put his money on anything, he would put his money on teaching kids it's the importance of self-control.
Okay. I want to follow up on that. We're talking about kids. We're talking about youth. And one thing that we haven't talked about is parents.
Yes.
And it's one of the criticisms that I think we hear when we talk about the Youth Criminal Justice Act is we say all this, but where are the parents? What are the roles of parents and guardians? How do you answer that?
Parents and caregivers are critical. Especially when these kids are young, it doesn't matter how young they are or they're teenagers or young adults, parents play a critical role in their child's life. And so therefore, we need to be engaging our parents. So in the program, the SNAP program, for example, we just don't work with the child. We work with their caregiver and their parent. We work with their schools. We work with the community because parents are the critical piece in that child's development. And so therefore, we can teach the child how to use SNAP. But we also need to teach the parents how to use SNAP, but also improve their effective parenting and give them strategies that can work. Also help them deal with the school, because a lot of these kids have difficulties and issues at school. So we want to be able to work with them so that and we have to also be fair to parents and caregivers. There's a lot going on in this world. I'm a parent. I can't tell you how many times my kids will say, Mom, I think you need to read some of those books you're writing, right? It's normal to react. But it's how we react, how we handle a scenario. And I think that's where that effective parent strategies, but also teaching children and parents and caregivers how to use calming strategies to improve their self-control, emotion regulation, self-control.
All right. Michael, I want to bring you in here a little bit about the perception of the Youth Criminal Justice Act. There's lots of criticisms of, is it too lenient? But I also want to pick up also on what Devin had mentioned about, how does public mistrust of police in racialized communities factor into the rise of youth violence?
Well, obviously, if you're not likely to go to the police for disputes or things that, I guess you could say taking matters into your own hands is really what we're talking about, because there is, at least what's reported, and certainly I see some of that in our clients and from as a Crown attorney, that there just isn't that relationship with a lot of the communities and our police, despite efforts and despite laudable goals on at least the part of the government to change that. But we see this all the time, where if someone is assaulted or in other ways offended, they're going to take matters into their own hands and not get the police involved. And that isn't always related to a mistrust in the police. Some of it ties back to societal and sort of peer pressures, where you don't want to be seen as someone that goes running to the police. The Christopher Husbands case is a classic example, where he had been the victim of gang violence and he armed himself for protection, encountered his assailants in the food court. Would have been better to call, police to try to help, but that wasn't his experience and it wasn't the way he chose to react. But that's not an uncommon reaction. And certainly in a trial I finished earlier this year, both accused persons had been shot and gravely wounded. And unfortunately, according to the jury at least, were guilty of acting that out against someone that had been involved in violence against them. So I think that's part of the reason, as well as just the relationship is we're still recovering from a lot of the carding controversy and other systems of the years past that communities at large have said we don't agree with, not just the so-called inner city communities that have the sort of complicated relationship with police. So,
Scott, I want to get you in on that as well.
Yeah, it's one of the issues that we've been asking youth, if you have been the victim of a crime, or if you were the victim of a crime, would you report it to the police? And hearing their responses are very nuanced. The rational thinkers, they will often say, I don't report to the police sometimes because I don't want to be labeled a snitch or a rat. In my community, if you cooperate with the police, you're going to be looked down upon. But you also get individuals who say, I don't trust the police. I've called the police in the past and I've been treated as a suspect, not as a victim. Or there's kind of a realistic view that the police, even if they wanted to help, couldn't be there all the time. They can't be my 24/7 bodyguard. I got to live in this community. This is the building I live in, and these are the issues here. So they have kind of a realistic view. I do find sometimes with witnesses, what we see is a kind of live by the sword, die by the sword mentality. So they'll say, I'm not going to risk my own safety for somebody who's been involved in the game or is selling drugs or is involved in the gang. I'm not going to risk my own safety by becoming involved. So for a lot of people living in the community, it's not that they don't want to help. It's they feel that by helping or by reporting to the police, their situation could deteriorate. So I do think that these are profound issues that sometimes I think that we need to work with the police to understand where communities feel about their interactions and why they don't cooperate. I think a lot of community policing initiatives in the past have been focused on helping youth feel better about the police. I think we can also use these kind of platforms to help police learn about the communities and humanize the communities that they engage with.
Lena, I want to talk about a case that is going through the courts right now, is one that a lot of people were alarmed to see. December 2022, 8 teenage girls were charged with the murder of a homeless man in Toronto. Shocking to many, of course, especially because these sounds were female. I'm wondering if you can walk us through the gender line. How has the gender breakdown in youth violence, have we seen changes in that as well?
Gender plays an important role, and we need to really think about how we treat males and females, boys and girls, for example. When I started this work over 39 years ago, when Canada raised the age of criminal responsibility from 7 to 12. Great move, by the way. We found that it was like 75% boys and 25% girls were coming to our attention.
Okay.
And it slowly started to increase to more 30% girls. So we started to see an increase, a slight increase, but boys still outweigh girls, hands down. We need to look at something that I've been learning about, researching, which is 7 years of warning, 7-year incubation period. We need to think about kids who end up in court at 14 and a half for committing a serious violent offense. When you go back into their records, any kindergarten teacher can tell you, I'm concerned about this child. By the time they're 9.5, they start getting more involved in delinquent activities, maybe theft, shoplifting, and then just before their 12th birthday, they commit their first serious delinquent offense, and at 14 and a half, they're in court for a serious violent offense. So when it comes to the pathway, we need to be able to think about how many individuals cross that child's pathway. So when we think about these girls, lots might be happening. First of all, it happened right after or during the pandemic or after. And so, again, I talk about isolation. I talk about relationships. Relationships is critical when it comes to these kids. We talk about the Kitty Genovese's case, the bystander apathy. Right. Why aren't people intervening? Why aren't they helping? Or why are they engaging when something like this happens? So I think we need to really look at gender. We need to think about how to treat genders differently if need be. There are really good risk-need assessment tools that we have to think about, and we talked about that earlier a little bit, that we really need to be able to catch these kids early, be able to assess them for their level of risk and need, and then be able to ensure that we have the right treatment approaches. And I know the Ontario government is looking at the custody facilities in the youth justice system as I speak. Right. I'm chairing that task force, the voluntary task force, and they've asked us to look at, interview the kids, the youth, interview the staff, interview the caregivers and the parents, and also all the engagement, all the experts out there to determine how to bring the system to a modernized system. And how do we formulate recommendations to the Minister Parsa for Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, to help improve what might be going on, and how do we improve the system? And that's the system for both boys and girls, as well as males and females.
All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. 27 minutes goes by really quickly. Michael, Lena, Devon, Scott, thank you so much. Really appreciate you guys on the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
When the province closes youth detention centers, what happens to the young offenders behind their walls? And where will the money saved from their closure go? Joining us now to discuss, Jessica Evans, Assistant Professor of Criminology at Toronto Metropolitan University, and we thank you for making the trip up here to join us today.
Thank you so much
here
for
at
having
TVO.
me.
Not at all. Now, there used to be a lot more youth detention centers in the province till about 3 years ago, and then something happened. Tell us what.
Yeah, so in 2021, in March of 2021, the Ontario government made a decision to close down 26 youth detention centres. 25 of these were operated by community-based organizations. One of them was operated by the province. Now, these closures happened because these detention centres were in low use, so they had a lot of quote-unquote beds free in these institutions. Now, the issue with the closures was that they happened behind closed-door planning. So what that meant was that the staff at the centres, they received, by and large, less than 24 hours notice that these closures were happening.
Was that fast?
Yes, very fast. So it was 2 years planning this, but all folks that were kind of working in these centres were kept in the dark. And so they were given less than 24 hours to plan for the transfer of these youth. And the youth themselves received sometimes just an hour's notice. They were woken up, they were transferred in shackles and handcuffs to new institutions. And there were a lot of issues with how that transfer was handled. So for example, 10 of the centres that were closed were in Northern Ontario, where a lot of Indigenous youth are. So these transfers meant transferring youth away from their communities and their homes and their families, which obviously impedes the ability of families to visit their youth in detention when they're being transferred to the south.
Did you think it was necessary to transfer youth in shackles in the way that they did?
Of course not. No, that is a traumatizing event. And these were youth that, were not necessarily flagged for major security concerns or anything. And so this was a really traumatizing event for youth in this position. In another case, there was a trans youth that was transferred to an institution that did not conform to their gender identity. Again, just really messy planning around this because it was kind of launched on folks within, 24 hours notice. So we saw a lot of disruption amongst youth through these closures.
Is that protocol, though?
No, typically not. No, normally people would be kind of kept in the loop about how these closures are happening so that staff can appropriately prepare the youth. One of the kind of core principles under the Youth Criminal Justice Act is something that's called relationship custody. And this is the idea that youth in detention need to be able to build trusting relationships with the folks that they're working with on a day-to-day basis. They need to believe that the folks that they're working with have their best interests at heart. And so the way that these closures happened really disrupted a lot of those bonds of trust that could have been fomenting. And usually there is a lot of effort made to avoid that disruption in the first place.
How old, or I guess I should say, how young to how old are all of these young people?
Yeah, so we're generally talking about youth between the ages of 12 years and 17 years of age.
So what does it do you think, long-term to a 12-year-old who experiences this?
Yeah, I think it undermines trust in the system in a lot of really substantive ways. I think it undermines the ability to trust in larger community as well. So a lot of the focus in these youth detention centers are working on things like mental health issues, trust with authority, trust amongst the community, and youth have to have a buy-in to the community, right? If they're going to go back into community and behave in ways that are, appropriate to our current kind of norms and laws, they have to believe that they're buying into something that has their interests at heart. And so seeing this happen, and we have to remember a lot of these youth are people that have themselves been victimized. And so this is just compounding the traumas experienced and really undermining trust in community, in systems of authority, and so on and so forth.
Well, I know there are going to be people watching this and listening to this right now who are saying to themselves, if they weren't such a bunch of badasses, they wouldn't be there in the first place, and therefore, que sera, sera. What's the response to that?
Yeah, so the response to that is that I think this relies on this assumption that we're dealing with exceptionally deviant youth, youth that have exceptional behavioral problems and so on and so forth, when in reality, these are youth that are dealing with exceptionally adverse circumstances in community. The vast majority of these youth are coming from situations of abuse, of trauma, of poverty, and these are all of the kinds of conditions that set folks up for greater involvement with the criminal legal system. And so, if we were doing more to address these things in community, we might not see youth having these engagements in the first place.
We reached out to the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services because we wanted to know what they thought about all this. And here's part of the statement they sent us. And Sheldon, if you would, you bring this graphic up and I'll read along for those listening on podcast. Our priority, they say, is the safety, well-being, and support of youth in conflict with the law. We are increasing funding for the youth justice sector by $11.6 million this year to address increased operational costs at agencies that support youth in the justice system. This year, we have invested more than $11 million in the Youth Outreach Worker Program. We are also investing more than $14 million in the Youth Opportunities Fund, which supports 39 community-led projects to help youth overcome social and economic barriers. Okay, your initial reaction to that is what?
So I think these are positive moves, right? These are moves in the right direction. I think, one of the issues is that there are community-based organizations that have been doing this work for a really long time, but have not seen any real increase in their operational budgets. I was just kind of perusing through some of the annual reports of these organizations before we came here. And most organizations their revenue is just meeting their expenditures. If not, they're dipping a little bit into kind of a deficit. Sometimes you see a little bit of revenue above expenditures, but we're dealing with organizations that are really kind of walking a tightrope in terms of finances. And so if funds are going to be increasing for these organizations, this is really wonderful news.
And just to be clear, the infractions that the young people would have had to commit to be in these facilities in the first place would be everything along a continuum of what to what?
Yeah, so I mean, you at the very kind of far end, you have youth engaging in violent crime, but at the lower end of things, you have property offenses. You have perhaps vandalism in repeated kind of offenses. So there's a wide range of engagements with criminalized activity that youth are kind of engaging with to end up in these spaces.
And the places that were shut down a few years ago because they were underutilized or whatever, what's happened to all of those facilities now?
Yeah, so some of those facilities rather have been earmarked to be transitioned into adult correctional facilities. So for example, the Cecil Fraser institution that is going to be shut down in Sudbury, it has not been shut down yet, but it's going to be shut down. That's going to be transitioned into a women's adult correctional facility. I don't know the full story about where all of those 26 or what all of those 26 facilities are doing right now, but some certainly have been transitioned into other aspects of the correctional system. And then, what we saw with the youth that were in those spaces is that they've been transferred to other correctional facilities or detention facilities. And those facilities themselves are now dealing with overcrowding issues.
So the one in Sudbury that's slated for closure soon, where will the young people who are there be transferred to most likely?
Yeah, so there's discussion about this, and I haven't been able to see anything certain, but my understanding is that there are two different areas that they'd be transferred to, and one would be a Brampton facility. The other, I believe I have this somewhere, but Brampton, I think, is kind of the largest facility.
Now, look, I'm not an A+ student in geography, but last I looked, Sudbury to Brampton is a long way.
It is quite a long way.
So if you're a kid from Sudbury, is it possible you can move a 15-year-old kid from Sudbury to Brampton?
Yeah, so I mean, those are large moves, right?
Yeah.
And those are going to, when folks are reintegrating into community as well, this means that they don't have those supports, those community supports when they're released, or that the families have to bear the burden, the financial burden of coming to these new spaces so that they can receive their youth when they are transitioned out of secure custodial facilities.
Typically, how often are you allowed to, if you've got a youth in a detention facility like this, how often are you allowed to visit if you're a family, friend, whatever?
So a lot of that varies from institution to institution, and it has to do with staffing issues. So do we have enough staff to facilitate the visitation? And what we're seeing in a lot of institutions is that staffing is one of the kind of pressing issues with the remaining facilities. So when the detention centers were closed in March 2021, the youth were transferred to still operational facilities. And so you saw, increases of, sometimes up to 15 beds in these institutions, but we didn't see a similar increase in funding or staffing. A lot of these institutions are operating at a base level of funding that hasn't changed in 17 years, and staffing wasn't increased when these shifts happened, and so that impacts all of the services that youth have access to in these institutions as well. Educational services, there's issues with, appropriately working out case management systems for the youth. Visitations would be impacted by this. Access to community would be impacted by this. So whether in an open or a secure detention facility, youth are usually given opportunities to go into community as part of their kind of rehabilitation process. But those opportunities start to dwindle when we see staffing shortages. So there's a whole host of kind of services that are intended to be part of the rehabilitative process that are limited when we're dealing with crunches on staff.
Well, you mentioned education. Let's pick up on that. Obviously, they get an education when they're in one of these facilities, but how does it work? What do they get?
Yeah, so the problem with education is that there is no kind of centralized system for managing education. So basically the provincial school boards, or rather school boards within the province, are not under any obligation or mandate to provide education for youth in detention. Now, they're required to provide education for all youth, but they're not required to move into those facilities, right? And so because youth are in a different facility, that requirement is kind of rendered null. And so what we have is local school boards engaging in voluntary memorandum of understanding with specific detention centers, and they work out, so the specific detention center and the specific school board then work out the curriculum, the hours of contact time, and so on and so forth amongst themselves.
I do a little comparison here.
Sure.
If you're going to quote unquote a regular school, I don't know, 8:30 to 3:30, something like that. How often are the teachers in these facilities?
So the minimum standard, I believe, is 5 hours of contact time per day. Some facilities you're seeing close to that, but reports have been done that suggest that as few as 2 hours a day is what some facilities are receiving, and sometimes none. So it really is, it's dependent on the specific institution and the MOU that it has with a specific school board. And again, because this is voluntary, those school boards can also come out of those agreements if they wish to do so.
If it's none, what are they doing all day?
It's a really good question. And again, the answer is oftentimes not a lot. So youth don't have a lot of access to things like physical activity, education. If it's not being provided in those kind of quantities, they're not getting access to that. And so they're perhaps spending a lot of time in kind of just languishing.
Let me do a couple other sort of how many and how long questions here. In a typical youth facility like this, how many young people would there be in each one?
Yeah, so it really ranges. Sometimes we have centers that are kind of in the 20 to 30 range, but we also have kind of what are referred to as almost supermax institutions, like the Roy McMurtry Center for Youth that has 192 beds. So it ranges quite significantly.
And what is the typical length of stay?
The typical length of stay, once again, varies quite significantly. Sometimes you're dealing with a few weeks or months. Sometimes you're dealing with multiple years. Again, it really has to do with the nature of the offense, with the ways in which youth are assessed for risk. So generally speaking, youth, when they enter into the system, undergo a risk needs assessment report. And this will kind of assess the youth based on their risk in terms of, potentially further harm in the public, their risk within the institution. But again, risk is also dealt with as an indicator of need. And so based on the kind of quantity and quality of needs that have been identified as criminogenic risk factors, the length of stay may vary as well.
It sounds like you've laid out a whole menu of things here that you think need to be improved. How focused or not is the current government of Ontario on improving these things?
So I think, there are some positive movements being made. So for example, the government announced over $40 million that it's committing to pediatric mental health, especially trying to reach those that are kind of hard to reach. So youth in poverty, youth in family transition, and those kinds of things. So that's definitely a positive step in the right direction. I think, much more could be done to divert youth from engagement with the system in the first place. And this can happen through a number of different kind of ways. So one is investing in community resources that get youth before they even cause harm in the first place. So this goes back to this idea of addressing, the nutritional needs, the educational needs, the mental health needs, the socializing needs.
It's upstream versus downstream solutions, right?
Absolutely.
You want to get them before they're in trouble.
Absolutely. I was just looking over the numbers, and within the TDSB, for example, the per pupil funding in 2018 was about $233 per pupil. This year it's $133. So we've seen a significant decline in per pupil funding in education. And of course, a lot of the youth that end up in the system also have, diverse educational needs. So increasing funding so that teachers can appropriately address the learning needs of youth would be one thing that would be really important here. The other thing is that youth have the opportunity, and under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, there is a requirement to, in all possible cases, divert youth from detention. This is supposed to be a last order. And certainly we are seeing kind of admissions into detention declining. But one of the points of contact is with police. And police can either decide to charge youth or divert them into restorative and transformative justice streams.
You prefer the latter, I presume.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's research that shows that recidivism is significantly reduced when the first point of contact is the last point of contact, right? So when contact with police is where contact with the justice system ends, we see a lot more kind of beneficial outcomes here. However, we're dealing with human beings that are making these decisions, right? Individual police officers. And oftentimes research has shown that racial bias, bias around poverty and these kinds of things often determine who gets decided or who's going to get diverted into restorative justice versus who is seen as more of a risk that needs to be diverted into detention facilities. And so more training and resources around the use of restorative justice, I think, would be a really positive move.
Jessica, for my last question, can you handle a wacky question?
I can try.
Okay, well, I see you're fulfilling your Second Amendment rights here, the right to bear arms. And we've had a lot of professors on this program, but none with a tattoo as amazing as that. Okay, you got to take us through that. What's going on that left arm of yours?
So this is an ode to my favorite movie, Alien.
Oh, for goodness sakes, look at that. So that's Ripley at the top?
Well, that's Ripley at the
Sigourney
top,
Weaver?
and we've got like the cat Jonesy here. We've got some face huggers and some aliens.
That is truly an amazing
I'm a
piece
bit
of
of
art.
a sci-fi nerd, and so this was something that I was excited to do.
I'll bet that hurt like crazy to have that put on.
It hurt quite a bit.
Well, that's amazing, and so was your presentation here today. Thank you very much for having us in.
Thank you so much.
Jessica Evans, Toronto Metropolitan University.
A nation that forgets its history has no future. So when you remember your history, you have to remember all of it. It's not a buffet. You can pick and offer there what you like and ignore what you don't like. It's all on the buffet.
I'm Hugh Ostrom. I'm the National Historic Site Superintendent for Parks Canada, and that means I'm responsible for a group of 19 historic sites here in Eastern Ontario. Today we are at Bellevue House National Historic Site in Kingston, Ontario, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and Huron-Wendat people. Bellevue House is the one-time home of Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. He lived here for 13 months in 1849. When he was an up-and-coming lawyer and aspiring politician here in the city of Kingston. And the house is a fine example of Italianate architecture. It really predates the Italianate architecture movement in Canada by about 50 years. So it's quite an abnormal specimen in a lot of ways, but it's in excellent condition. The redesign of the house, the remodeling work, started with some structural issues that we were made aware of back in 2018. When that work was being done, it was identified that the plaster ceiling was damaged. So the keys were breaking and the ceiling was at risk of delaminating and falling on visitors. So we had to close the house to make the place safe. And that necessitated us removing all the furniture and artifacts and everything else from the home to do those repairs. And that put us in a position where we could think about what we do next. We started a process of focus groups to look at what various communities would like to see in the home. We connected with Indigenous members of the Kingston community and the surrounding First Nations and started to have some sincere and direct conversations about the impacts of Macdonald on Indigenous communities and how we can represent their stories.
I'm Chief R. Donald Miracle, the elected chief of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. My Mohawk name is Adarot Sario, which means good friend, and I'm a member of the Wolf Clan. In the last few years, the government has adopted a policy that there has to be First Nations consultations on things that are of interest to our history or that of national importance, and so Parks Canada invited our community to participate in this exercise.
So we formed a community advisory committee to help navigate Sir John A. Macdonald's history, Canada's history, and Bellevue House's history. For the Parks Canada team that was involved in it, we learned an awful lot about the history we weren't telling, the things that we didn't know, the history that wasn't written in books. And it was a great opportunity for us to learn and be able to create exhibits that can help the broader public and our visitors learn those things as well.
Well, it incorporated to some extent, the relationship, what the impacts of Sir John A. Macdonald's policy on the First Nations people. I think it makes it complete when you tell the full story. I don't think, again, that people are asking people to hate anybody because of it. It's just to learn more, and maybe it will contribute toward becoming a more just society.
The house is sort of separated into two main sections thematically for visitors. The ground floor, when you enter the house, is very much a time capsule of the 1840s, and it represents the power and privilege that Macdonald or someone of similar stature would have been trying to present in a home like this. A lot of the furniture and furnishings, wallpaper and that sort of thing are very rich. And as you go up the stairs to the second sort of main level of the house, we talk more about Macdonald's policy, its impacts on specific communities in Canada, and the long-lasting legacy of Macdonald's government, the policies, and Confederation.
Hello, bonjour, welcome to Bellevue House. My name is Eli. I'll be guiding you throughout the house today. So here at Bellevue House, we'll be sharing a sort of more complete history of Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada's first Prime Minister. The dining room is our space here at Bellevue House for discussing the roles of privilege and status here in the home. In particular, we discuss the image that Sir John A. Macdonald was trying to shape for himself and the wealth that he was trying to sort of project during this period in his life.
To me, the dining room really encapsulates much of what the British Empire was in the 1840s, sort of the height of its power through the 19th century. And the dining room really demonstrates how that came to be presented in what would be the 1% of the 1840s, that the wealthy and the elite, and how they were able to obtain things from throughout the empire, and how that was not available to the vast number of people that lived within the empire.
So, welcome to the nursery. Children during this period of time would have had an entirely different set of responsibilities, an entirely different set of challenges. This would differ to a major extent based on what Canadian community you were from, which race you were born into. Here in the nursery, visitors can also come and take a look at this video right here, which discusses the lives of children living within the residential school system here in Canada, which would have had direct connections to Sir John A. Macdonald himself.
Kill the Indian in the child. The Truth and Reconciliation Commissions describe the residential school system as a form of cultural genocide. Today, we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong and reflects a dark and shameful time in Canada's history.
I did ask one of the people of Wilbert Miracle, actually, when they were taking down the statues of Sir John A. Macdonald. I said, what do you think about it, Wilbert? Because he was a resident at the Mohawk Institute Residential School. He was taken when he was he's a young boy. And he said, I think they should leave it there. But he said people should learn more about the history of Sir John A. Macdonald, the full history. And so I don't think that the elders really advocated destroying anything, but they did insist that Canadians should learn more and should take an interest in learning more.
I will now be taking you into the guest room here at Bellevue House. The guest room is an ideal space for us to talk about who would have been invited to Bellevue House in particular during 1848 to 1849. We also used the space to discuss who would have been excluded from Sir John Macdonald's later political conversations. This is our space for visitors to learn some perspectives from representatives of communities who would have been excluded from their invite to discussing Canada's future around the time of 1867, around Confederation.
I would say that the community reaction to this redesign has been quite positive. The city of Kingston sort of collectively and the cultural institutions in the city have been on a journey understanding Sir John Macdonald and Confederation for a while now together.
The policies of the government of Sir John Macdonald had a profound impact on First Nations people and how they were perceived by the colonizing nation, and also the exercise of their traditional and Aboriginal and treaty rights. I think some of the contributions that he made are positive. Canadians do benefit from the CPR railway line that was constructed to unite the east and western provinces. So I think we have to all see that as a positive benefit for everyone. But Sir John Macdonald didn't start the residential schools, but he continued it during his prime ministership, and he built a number of them across the country. So you can't deny the good and the bad. It happened.
To the idea that we're erasing history, and this is a conversation we've had a few times with visitors, and there has been media about it as well. And I think that what we're doing here is not erasing history. We are simply exposing layers of history that haven't been shared before, and that Macdonald was still Canada's first prime minister.
Without him, Canada would look very different. And we're not here to say whether or not that's good or bad. We're here to simply talk about the information, share the facts and share the stories and how that has affected other communities, and expand the story about Macdonald.
And I think there is an appetite for a lot of Canadians to learn more about the history of the country that we live in. And there have been Canadians who have been here for a few centuries, have been steeped in what the Crown wanted them to know. But it's not a full education system. And so the government recognizes that it's incomplete. A lot of these things are tucked away in the archives of the government and kept under lock and key. But it's time now to unlock that and let Canadians know the full story.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, October 10th, 2024. Tomorrow, John Michael McGrath and I will return with a new episode of On Poly, where we'll unpack the province's decision to review Ontario's children's aid societies. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.